Ken, after our last episode, and the way it ended with Jesus saying he was giving them a judgment, like, "Behold, I leave your temple unto you desolate." Do you think the disciple, and I'm not trying to get you ahead of your teaching you've got laid out, but this is a question I had. Do you think the disciples understood that he was actually pronouncing judgment? Like, were they knowledgeable enough of the Old Testament scriptures that said that when, like the temple being destroyed was going to be the judgment on Jerusalem, was going to be the end of the Old Covenant age? Or, because I was just thinking about, why are they asking these questions? And I don't know, what do you think about that?
Absolutely. Their understanding of the Old Testament was so vast that these little words that are throwaway words for us meant a lot to them. And so when Jesus, at the end of where we left off last time, at the end of Matthew 23, he pronounced to them that he was going to destroy the temple. And in verse number 33, ye serpents, we talked about that theming of the serpents. Verse number 34, he said, I sent you people, you crucified them. 35, upon you may come all the righteous blood. Verse 36, all these things shall come upon this generation. So yes, they understood that this was a pretty big deal. To leave the house desolate is one of the key things in verse 38. When he said, I'm going to leave unto you, your house is left unto you desolate. That was a really big deal. In fact, that kind of brings us to our first major theming we're going to look at in chapter 24.
I wanted to ask you one more thing then.
Sure.
Is there a way to do like a quick summary of this?
Yeah.
And then for those that can stick around longer, hopefully everybody will, that we can dive a little deeper into it, because that's where I start having fun.
Absolutely. Let's do that. In fact, we're going to go over just the first 3 verses of Matthew 24. We're going to work our way through. Now, in Matthew 24, as it is in most prophetic passages, it's riddled, and I mean riddled, with what I like to call hyperlinks, because I think it makes sense to us. We all know what a hyperlink is. When you go and check out something on the internet and there's a word that's usually a different color and underlined, Wikipedia is kind of famous for this. It's just a bunch of hyperlinks. If you see something you like, you can hover over it, click on it, and it brings you to another page. Most prophetic passages are riddled with what we would call hyperlinks, or a callback to a different passage. So you'd be amazed. These 3 verses right here, I've had to cut down a tremendous amount to make the video, to where we can have it a length people will stick around. There is so much more information than this.
Don't leave anything out. I mean,
well,
let us know where all these hyperlinks are, man.
So
if people got to go, they can come back and pick it up later. But
I like that. Okay,
this is too good and too important.
It is good. You guys those that are watching will really enjoy seeing this study. Let's go ahead and do the overview, like you said. I think that's a great idea. We'll do just kind of a jet flyby, an overview of these 3 verses. I'll give a little bit of commentary, and then hopefully that'll at least build like a skeletal structure, and then we'll go back and hang a bunch of meat on this. Because when Jesus said these words, the disciples understood them in the context of their, what we call the Hebrew scriptures. So we have to go back and...
So you're saying they understood the Old Testament scriptures better than we do?
Oh man, yes. Most Christians are pretty ignorant of the Old Testament. And the culture is just so hard to understand. It's 2,000 years removed, even on the New Testament end, let alone going back to the beginning of where Abraham was. We're going back, 3,500 years when it was written. But let's go ahead and read it. We'll make some simple comments, and then we'll work our way through. So where we just left off in our last video in Matthew chapter 23 is Jesus excoriated, he eviscerated the Pharisees. He gave them the 8 woes, and they were a complete contradiction, or contrast, I should say. The other side of the coin of the of the Beatitudes that Jesus gave, which was really the Sermon on the Mount, is kind of like the founding documents of this new kingdom that Jesus is bringing in. He's bringing in the new kingdom, the kingdom of God. And we're going to see this play out where he's going to start describing what those in his kingdom act like. And then we see the other side of that in Matthew 23 with the 8 woes that are coming upon those that are the apostates. He tells them that they're going to be destroyed. And he's in the property of the temple. Now, folks should understand there's more than one building. We kind of see like a temple picture, but this is a whole campus. And it is a tourist attraction. Herod rebuilt this thing and it was just beautiful. So if you can, like imagine like for us would be like New York City. You would take your camera, you want to take some pictures of the Empire State Building or the Statue of Liberty. This is kind of like what that was. People wanted to make sure they stopped and saw Herod's temple. It was absolutely beautiful. And so Jesus walks out of the temple campus and he walks through what we call the Eastern Gate. And in verse number 24, or verse 1 of Matthew 24, we'll start there. Jesus went out and departed from the temple. His disciples came to him for to show him the buildings of the temple. Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. Verse 3, And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? So we have this incredible 3 verses here that starts us down this journey of Matthew 24. So here's the jet overview of this thing. The jet overview of this thing is that we have a pattern in the Old Testament of the Lord judging Israel. And we're going to get into these in the more detailed part. And he leaves the temple. His presence leaves the temple, and then he will destroy the city of Jerusalem or punish them in some way. We see many, many patterns of this. And so it's significant in verse 1 where Jesus says he departed from the temple. That's the presence of the Lord leaving. We'll get into this a little bit more later. But during this week, Jesus had been visiting the temple every day and leaving every night and goes to the Mount of Olives. Really what's happening here, and I'll show you this in great detail, what's happening here is Jesus is changing the location of the Holy of Holies from the temple to the Mount of Olives. He's taking that temple structure and he's removing it outside the city walls and he's setting it up on the Mount of Olives. Every night he goes there to sleep. And when he says the words, let's go to verse 1. The disciples came and said to show him the buildings of the temple. They're like, hey, this is great. The Messiah's here. He's our new king. And this temple is going to be our headquarters for our new movement. And this is going to be absolutely incredible. And so they're
So they thought that temple was going to be in the Messianic age as well?
Oh yeah. They were probably saying who gets what office. I get the corner office. These guys are like, Jesus called us specifically, and this is where we're going to be.
Okay. I just had a thought.
Uh-huh.
Is that what the disciples meant when they asked him, when you come into your kingdom, can I sit on your right hand and he sits on the left hand? Were they thinking about when he comes into his kingdom, and he sits in this temple? Do you think they were thinking that? And they're like, like you just said, can I have this office on this side of you and this office over here?
There's no way to know, but I don't think that's a far-fetched thing at all. I think they were already pre-planning ahead. What does this mean that the new king has called me to be one of his assistants, one of his workers? And I think you're absolutely right. Their eyes got real big and they got excited about the fact that they get to now spend so much time in the temple. So it says in verse 1, it's almost like in verse 1, if you read it, the disciples wanted to remind Jesus how amazing the temple was. Look what they do in verse 1. His disciples came to him for to show him the buildings of the temple, as if he didn't know about them, as if he didn't recognize their splendor. They were, Lord, Jesus, look at these buildings. They're amazing. Well, Jesus said unto them in verse 2, See ye not all these things? Now, we're going to go into that in a little bit more detail later, but that word see right there has more than the idea of look. The word see there has to do with understand or a comprehensive kind of understanding. It's actually a different word than we see in Matthew 23 when he says look. But we'll get into that more. But he says, look, I see these things, verily I say to you, there shall not be one left stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. This is an idea of a total destruction. This is the end of the Judaic age. This is now the complete total destruction of a whole system The sacrificial system now is being done away with. And we're going to go in this in detail later, but our overview, Jesus is drawing from Leviticus 14. Leviticus 14 gives instructions for the priest on what they're supposed to do if there's sin in somebody's house. And we're going to look at that in a second. And the last remedy, the last ditch effort is destroy the whole thing. Don't let any stone be upon another. We'll look at that. Then he sits down on the Mount of Olives. The disciples now come to him privately saying, tell us, what shall these things be? So there's one question, shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world. Now here's where the rubber meets the road on this thing. If they're asking three different questions, which most popular Bible teachers today say they're asking three questions, then we have to understand his answer, and we get to choose and break down where he starts answering the next question, because it's all one conversation. My proposal for this video will be, I believe it's all really one topic question, but there's two parts to it, which is just basically simply this. I think they're asking, when shall these things be? In other words, when are these things about the destruction of the temple going to happen? And then they just ask this, and what's the sign of this happening? I know it says coming. I'll get to that in a second. So they're just asking, when is this going to happen? When are these things going to come to pass? And how will we know when it's going to happen? What's the sign of these things? So that is basically what we see here, and Jesus is answering that question in the rest of Matthew 24. Now, I know what folks are saying. It says world, it says coming. I get that. We're going to go over that in the longer version. But basically, all we're going over in this video is just very simply that we're continuing the conversation for Matthew 23 that everybody can go back and watch. We're continuing that conversation where he condemns the Pharisees, and he says, I'm going to, in this generation, the blood of righteous, remember we talked about the blood of righteous Abel, it's going to come upon this generation. You're going to pay the piper, and there's now a covenant lawsuit coming against apostate Jews. And Jesus is making this declaration. Now we see his presence leaving the temple, and he's setting up a garden temple outside of the eastern gate on the Mount of Olives. And so when he does that, he starts telling them and saying, this is going to happen. Not one stone is left upon another. Call back to Leviticus 14. And then they say, oh my goodness, because they know Leviticus 14. And these guys are going, when's this going to happen? And when is the end of the Judaic age? When's the end of the Old Covenant? When is the end of the sacrificial system? When is all of this ending? And then we go into verse 4, and Jesus starts answering that question. So that's the overview. Now, there's a lot of detail. So
Good.
that's the overview.
Good, because I have many questions if you leave something out. I'm gonna let you speak first.
Okay. All right, let's go. Let's start here. There is a biblical template for God's presence leaving the temple if Israel is in rebellion. So let's just start at the beginning. I'm going to just really focus on this very first phrase, and Jesus went out and departed from the temple. Let's look at that. Exodus chapter 33 and verse 7. I'll just show you a couple of examples here so we can keep on moving through our study. Exodus chapter 33 and verse number 7. And Moses took the tabernacle and pitched it without the camp. Notice he took, okay, by the way, just so we're all on the same page, this is the response to the golden calf incident. So Moses took the tabernacle and pitched it without the camp, meaning outside of the camp, afar off from the camp. So the response of this is God removes the tabernacle, and he called it the tabernacle of the congregation. And it came to pass that everyone which sought the Lord went out of the tabernacle of the congregation, which was without the camp. So it was very clear on that. Came to pass when Moses went up onto the tabernacle, that all the people rose up and stood every man at his tent door and looked after Moses until he was gone into the tabernacle. So one of the responses there is we see this pattern beginning, that if there is sin in the camp, that the presence of the Lord begins to move away from the people. Let's go again, 1 Samuel this time, working our way through. 1 Samuel in chapter 4. This is, of course, we could really make this chapters 1 through 4, but we'll just focus in on one part of it. Remember the incredible depth of sin that was in Israel at this time. Remember Eli's sons. They were basically taking advantage of the fact that their dad was a high priest, and they were They were sleeping with prostitutes and they were doing whatever they wanted to in the temple. And they said, Dad can just make an offering for us. We can have free reign here. In verses 10 and 11, the response of that was the Philistines fought and Israel was smitten. They fled every man into his tent, and there was a very great slaughter, for there fell of Israel 30,000 footmen. And the ark of God was taken. There's the presence. That's equivalent to Jesus departing. And the ark was taken, and the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were slain. So they got their reward there for their wickedness. And the temple was taken, is the point there. The presence was taken. And by the way, we don't see that return again in Israel until Solomon is building the temple. That's a little while. Let's turn one more place in Ezekiel chapter 10. I'm just showing you a pattern of when there's sin in the camp that the Lord removes his presence. Ezekiel chapter 10. Ezekiel chapter 10. In Ezekiel chapter 10, the Lord leaves the temple in Jerusalem. I'm just going to talk through this one because there's just so much here. We can read the very beginning of it. Ezekiel 10:1. Then I looked and behold, the firmament that was above the head of the cherubims that appeared over them, as it were sapphire stone, as the appearance of likeness of a throne. And he spake unto the man clothed with linen, and said, Go between the wheels, even unto the cherubims, and fill thine hand with the coals of fire between the cherubims, and scatter them over the city in my sight. Now, if you want to look at verse 4, the glory of the Lord went up from the cherubs, you can read down through this thing, and you're going to find out that it was the Lord that leaves the temple that was in Jerusalem. But here's the really cool part of this story, is that the presence of the Lord goes with some of the exiles to Babylon. And right after this happened, the temple was destroyed. So when we talk about Jesus leaving the temple in Matthew 24, it's a significant moment that is exactly on par with what we would expect God to do if there was an incredible amount of sin inside the city. So when Jesus leaves that, and it says in Matthew chapter 24, and Jesus departed from the temple, this was the last time. This was the final time that he left the temple. And at this point, he just made the announcement, as you said in verse 38 of Matthew 23, Behold, your house, he told the Pharisees, no longer his father's house. In Matthew 21, remember we said it was my father's house. You've made my father's house. Matthew 23:38, he says, your house. Now it's just a building, and your house is left to you desolate. In other words, the Spirit is gone. So I want folks to be able to understand this as you're looking in through the eastern gate. And people could even, I guess, Google this, and you could even see images of this. But you can look through where the eastern gate would be. You could find a diagram of this, and where the temple would be. Imagine the temple being there and the eastern gate, and then right outside that would be a clear shot to the Mount of Olives. So it's kind of a clear shot there.
You know, today I actually saw a picture of the Eastern Gate, and it's filled in. It's closed.
Oh yeah, yep.
When did that happen?
We'll get into it. How about that?
Okay.
We'll get into it.
I told you I had questions.
I love it. I'll just remind me, but we will definitely get into that.
Okay.
In verse number 1, then Jesus went out and departed from the temple. His disciples came to him to show him the buildings of the temple. Now, Jesus' response in verse number 2, as I stated, Jesus said unto them, See ye not these things? Now, what an odd thing to say. If you were showing me, if we were at your house, Jimmy, and you said, I want to show you my house, and you point and you look at your house, say, I want to show you my house. And I say to you, Jimmy, do you not see all these things? You'd say, what things am I supposed to be seeing? This word see, as I stated earlier, is a different kind of word for the word see. I usually don't try to pronounce the Greek word because nobody cares, but this is a different word than the word that we see in Matthew 23:39. Look just one verse above. Verse 39, For I say unto you, you shall not see me henceforth, till you shall say, Blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord. That word see has much more to do with perceiving or looking. There's some understanding along with that, like you'll see and understand. But really this word in Matthew 24:2 has the idea of, remember, they just showed him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus' response is, You guys, you need to be able to see. In other words, what he's saying is you need to understand all of the things that have led up to this. So that's going to be our task in this video, is to try and understand all the things that have led up to this moment. He says, I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. Now, next to that in your Bibles, if you write in your Bibles or you're taking notes, you could just simply put right next to that Leviticus 14. So in Leviticus 14, we are going to learn about a very, very important historical lesson that we need to know that they certainly knew. We're going to learn about when they go into the land of Canaan, and he's giving instructions to Moses and Aaron. And he says, if somebody comes to you and complains about mildew, the word in the Bible is leprosy. It talks about leprosy in the house. So house leprosy is like mildew. And it gives instructions for what they are supposed to do. And the priest is to go and visit with them. And there's let's just go ahead and turn there. Leviticus 14 in verses 33 through 53. Jesus basically was telling these disciples the result of an inspection that he made in Jerusalem. And so we're going to look at that. Leviticus chapter 14, and let's look at verses 33 through 53. We're going to first just look in 33 through 38. 33 through 38. The Lord spake unto Moses and Aaron, saying, when ye be come into the land of Canaan, which I gave to you for a possession, and I put the plague of leprosy in a house of the land of your possession, he that owneth the house shall come and tell the priest, saying, it seemeth to me there is as it were a plague in the house. Now that is the idea of the mildew we're talking about. It even goes on here to describe a reddish green color, so we know what it is. If you think of a house having if a house had a skin disease, that's kind of what we're talking about. We also know it's been shut up. We'll find that for a second in a little bit here. Verse 36. So then the priest shall command that they empty the house. So that's step one. So the initial inspection, or I could say inspection number one, the priest is to go, and the priest is to, when you say, hey, there is some mildew in my house, the priest says, I want you to empty the house. This is during his first inspection. So if you had a home inspector come over and you had mildew in your house, inspection number one is what we're talking about right now. Inspection number one, it states here in the Bible that if you go and tell the priest to come, verse 36, he is going to come and command that house be emptied. But the priest go into to see the plague, that all that is in the house be not made unclean. In other words, I'm going to try and take the furniture out so it doesn't also get mildewy. Afterward, the priest shall go in to see the house. He shall look on the plague, and behold, if the plague be in the walls of the house, with hollow strakes, greenish or reddish, which in sight are lower than the wall, then the priest shall go out of the door of the house and shut up the house for 7 days. So there's two parts to this. The very first inspection, this house inspection the priest is making, is he's going to first empty the house. Second thing he's going to do is he's going to leave for a period of quarantine. He's going to go away for a while, and he's going to shut up the house. He's going to leave away from there. There's some sort of a quarantine type idea where that is now shut up. That's the first inspection. Now, what if that doesn't work? He's got to go back and inspect it after this point. So now we have him coming out for a second time, and that's in verses 39 through 42. So after that 7 day, of course, in the Hebrew, the 7 days, you should always hear that and think completion. So when this comes to completion, when the quarantine is complete, verse 39, and the priest shall come again the 7th day and shall look, and behold, if the plague be spread in the walls of the house, then the priest shall command that they take away the stones in which the plague is, and they shall cast them into an unclean place without the city. Again, it's kind of reminiscent what we were learning in Exodus 33. Take that tabernacle without the camp. This is taking the stones without the city. Verse 41. And he shall cause the house to be scraped within round about, and they shall pour out the dust, and they scrape off without the city into an unclean place. They shall take the other stones and put them into a place of those stones, shall take the other mortar and shall plaster the house. If the plague come again, break out in the house. Okay, so that's our second inspection. I almost went to the third one. So our second inspection is we're going to start removing these stones. That's what we're going to do in the second inspection. Now, we have to come back a third time if we still see some mildew in there. Our third inspection is in 43 through 46. And if the plague come again, verse 43, and break out in the house, after he that hath taken away the stones, and after he hath scraped the house, and after it is plastered, then the priest shall come and look, and behold, if the plague be spread in the house, it is a fretting leprosy in the house, it is unclean. In other words, there's no hope for it at this point. And he shall break down the house, the stones of it, the timber thereof, and all the mortar of the house, and shall carry them forth out of the city into an unclean place. Moreover, he that goeth into the house all the while that is shut up shall be unclean until the even. So the third inspection, this one is a total destruction of this house. Everything is taken apart. All the stones are removed. So let's go back over to Matthew 24 for a moment and think through. When the disciples came to show him the buildings of the temple, and they said, look at this, look at it. At that point, Jesus reminded them what was going to be the final outcome, which is total removal of all the stones. Now, as we're going through here, it's important to remember, how has God done this inspection? Well, let me bring you to a couple places to show this inspection idea, because we see this throughout the Bible. One is in Zechariah chapter 5. So we'll go to our minor prophets, Zechariah 5, because there's been multiple times before Jesus was on the scene that the temple had been inspected. Look at the wording here in Zechariah 5, verses 1 through 4. Then I turned and lifted up mine eyes and looked, and behold, a flying roll. This has to do with the Bible. This has to do with the word of God, the flying scroll. And he said unto me, what seest thou? And I said, I see a flying roll. The length thereof is, this is very important, folks, 20 cubits, and the breadth of it 10 cubits. Then he said unto me, this is the curse that goeth forth over the face of the whole earth. For everyone that sealeth shall be cut off as on this side according to it, and everyone that sweareth shall be cut off as on the side according to it. I will bring it forth, saith the Lord of hosts, and it shall enter into the house of the thief, and into the house of him that sweareth falsely by my name. And shall remain in the midst of the house, and shall consume it with the timber thereof and the stones thereof. So here's what's happening. You see the word of God flying into the city, and when he finds a house that is guilty of sin, he now is judging it on two things. Number one, false swearing, or in other words, false worship. Not making an oath to the Lord, but making an oath to something else. And the second thing was being a thief, stealing. Now, let's take these two things right here, and I want to show you something kind of amazing here. Let's go back to Matthew chapter 21. Matthew 21. Now, we know, as we're turning to Matthew 21, by the way, let me just bring together some thoughts here. We know that Jesus had his first inspection of the temple early in his ministry. In fact, it was found, and we can turn there in a moment, but let me just kind of put this. It was found in John chapter 2. In John chapter 2. It's really early on in John. In fact, I'm sorry for having us turn there. Let's go ahead and hold our place in Matthew 21. Let's turn to John 2, just so we can do this in order. And look, if you would, beginning in verse number 14. And found in the temple that those sold oxen, sheep, and doves, and the changers of money sitting. When he had made a scourge of small cords, he drove them all out of the temple. Whoa, what did we just see there, Jimmy? What did he do? He emptied the house.
Emptied it.
First inspection. That's found in John chapter 2, pretty early on in his ministry. First inspection, he started saying, you guys got to get out of here. You guys have got to get out of there. Now let's go to his second inspection. As far as we know, there was not an inspection between these, but it's found in Matthew 21. We're going to go to his second inspection, Matthew chapter 21. In Matthew chapter 21, in verses 12 through 14, look exactly what he says here. And Jesus went into the temple of God and cast out all of them that sold and bought in the temple and overthrew the tables of the money changers, and the seats of them sold doves. Now look at what he says. And he said unto them, it is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer. That's the first thing. But ye have made it a den of thieves. Prayer is what it should be, but you don't use it as a house of prayer. You don't have a positive oath to God. You have a false oath to people, and you're worshiping something else. That's the first thing. The second thing is you're stealing. You're a thief. You're stealing people's money. What was the flying scroll in Zechariah 5 looking for? False swearing, false oaths, and people who are stealing things. And Jesus did an inspection exactly like in Zechariah 5, and he found exactly those two things for them to be guilty of. He says it was supposed to be a house of prayer, but you don't use it for that. That's a way of positively praying to the Lord, but you're doing false oaths. You're not doing a godly oath. You're not praying to the Lord God of Israel. You're committing idolatry in here. And you know what else you're doing? You're stealing people's money. Those are exactly the two things that he found. So during his second inspection, he begins the process of this removing stones idea. Now, where we find ourselves in this is that he has his first inspection of the temple in John chapter 2. He has his second inspection of the temple in the passage we're reading about in Matthew 24. Because remember, Matthew 21 through 24, actually really 21 through 25, is really all the same week. And so here he's going in the temple every day and going back out at night, and he's sleeping at the Mount of Olives. In the morning he goes into the temple, people are listening to him teach. At night he goes back into the Mount of Olives. I'll show you why he's doing that in a second because it's really fascinating. But he ends his ministry only doing the two inspections, and there's no final removal of the stones. So what Jesus is saying here is not one stone will be left on another.
If you like this video, hit that like and subscribe button, and check out the full episode by clicking the link below.